Hello everyone. I've just had the opportunity, indeed the privilege, of interviewing the Reverend Colin Chambers, who for many years from the late 70s was prison chaplain on the infamous Robben Island. In that capacity, he got to know at quite a personal level the one and only Nelson Mandela. He came to speak here at Media City at the Life Stories at Lunch event. We filmed it just on a camera at the back of the room, I'm afraid, but it's the content that is important. And I began by asking him to describe that very first encounter with the great man.
I was taken into this room. There were 432 prisoners on the island, but the leading prisoners, Nelson Mandela and about 20 of them, 23 I think, they were kept separately. And I was taken into this one room, and there was about 7 or 8 there, and this rather enormous man nearly crushed my hand, and all he said was, "The name's Mandela. Wow, you're very welcome. How was the sea? And how's your father?" And that was how I met Nelson Mandela. I can, if I've got a second, I can add a caveat to that. How's your father? When I was in South Africa 2 years ago, I was driving to Heeltown, the old Methodist missionary school where Mandela was at school, and I put the radio on, one of those iconic moments, and there was a lady teaching how to speak. I've got to click now. Xhosa. And she said something that just riveted my attention. She was giving some of the Xhosa culture, and she said, if a leading member of the Xhosa group, tribal grouping, asks you, how's your father, it's a sign that you've been accepted. And I was so sorry that I learned that a year and a half after he'd passed away.
So there you were accepted into this group of high security prisoners on Robben Island. So what kind of encounters did you have? I mean, there must have been, presumably as a chaplain, fairly intimate encounters with and conversations with Nelson Mandela.
Yes, and others too. It wasn't exclusively. The one that I probably got the closest to was a man called Raymond Mhlaba. He was the first Premier of the Eastern Cape. With Nelson Mandela, very often it was in his cell with a cup of coffee. You'd get some hot water from the warder and mix some coffee.
And so what, I mean, this was several years before his release.
Yeah.
What was his state of mind? What were his concerns that he brought to you as a chaplain? What were those conversations like?
One of his concerns that he brought, and without going into depth of he was always, I think I can say, he was always very concerned about his family, how they were managing with he as the father. Don't forget, by that time he'd lost his son in 1969 in a road accident. We talked about that. That was an area of grief that he was still dealing with when I first went there. And I think it was a time where he wasn't allowed to go to the funeral, not even with an armed guard. And I think that he battled to get over that and get closure, if you ever get closure, when you lose someone very close to you. And it was the one time where I actually saw the great man with tears in his eyes welling up. I'm not the only one who has seen that family, but that was one issue. He had a great concern for the country, he really did.
I want to take you back a step, if we may, because so many of us will remember events, but it's very easy to forget. Could you just paint a picture of what South Africa was like at that time and in the years just before and after? Just how difficult and volatile was that country?
Yes, tense. I would say that at that particular time, especially into the 80s, South Africa was a powder keg just ready to be ignited. The security forces weren't going to give up, and the liberation struggle, or whatever you want to call it, was growing in momentum, and it was like two forces coming together, neither one prepared to give. And I say it without any shadow of doubt. South Africa was heading for civil war, and there would have been bloodshed, and it wasn't white on black, if I can use those terms. It was probably one of the most divided countries in the world. There was the two white groups, English and Afrikaners. There was the mixed race group. There was the African groupings that the Xhosas didn't trust the Zulus. It was hard to explain and describe if you weren't there at the time, but it was underlying, bubbling friction.
How then, and this is an enormous question, how would you characterise the fact that there wasn't civil war, and that at the time that you were visiting this man in prison, could you ever have imagined or hoped of the outcome that came those years later? How dramatic was that?
I realised, getting to know Nelson Mandela, and he was the undoubted leader of the 432 prisoners on the island. He was one of those people that, without saying anything, it might sound mystical, but I'm not trying to be mystical. If we were sitting here today and Mandela walked in the back door there, back entrance there, you'd all be aware of his presence, okay? So I was very much aware that this man could have a role, but it didn't seem possible because President Botha was intransigent and would never have released him. But my hope was, especially as a Christian, is the nation was praying. That was one interesting thing. When there was a drought, South Africa was called to pray, and there was a lot of prayer. Stadiums were full of people praying, and events started going there. But back to your question, most South Africans, especially white South Africans, didn't like even the name Mandela. And I used to say to people, well, you'll see he's not like that if he comes out. The church that I pastored, I used to sometimes say that Mr. Mandela sends his greetings, and I was asked to stop saying that because it was offensive to people, and people find that hard to understand in hindsight. But I suppose if there were people here, and I said to you, I've been to Belmarsh prison this morning, and Abu Qatada sends his greetings, just to pick a name out. Some of you might find that offensive. So if that was the sort of scenario in the country.
Well, because Mandela was an angry young man, wasn't he? And a very, an activist, some would say even a terrorist. How did you see any of that transformation?
Yes, I think the seeds were sown at, Mandela was at a Methodist missionary school, and he was actually a Bible study leader at that school in his last year. And I think that, I often wonder how often they prayed, and he would have led prayers as forgive us our trespasses as we forgive them that trespass against us. And initially, when the struggle began, it wasn't meant to be an armed struggle, but it degenerated. And often, when you start something, it gets out of control, and it did become. And I don't think Mandela ever wanted it to become violent. You know, Mandela's closest friend, the people he spent his first night out of prison with, was Desmond Tutu. And so Archbishop Tutu said that Nelson Mandela went into prison an angry, violent young man, got converted and came out an icon of reconciliation and peace. So I would use the words of that well-known Archbishop Tutu. I did see the change. I did see the change very much. He had a tremendous love for the country and a burden and a desire to somehow bring the country together. And he had that saying, which I think is a very good saying. He had many sayings, but the one one of the ones I really like is, it always seems impossible until it's done. And he used that in prison in one chat one day. He said the situation looks impossible, but it always seems impossible until it's done. Whether he saw himself as that man that could do it, I think he did. But the chance of being released were,
gosh. And you mentioned that, you know, Archbishop said that he was converted in prison, and yet I remember him very much as the politician, perhaps didn't make any direct claims to faith. How would you describe that? Was he a religious man? Did you see that? Was that part of his transformation?
yes, I don't think, you know, Archbishop Tutu said he was converted in prison. I think the seeds were sown at the Methodist Missionary School. But I think it was put to the back burner, and I think the realization came slowly and steadily when he was in prison more and more. In his book, he does write, he does make the claim that he is a Christian, but when he was out, he was first and foremost a people's person, and he was a politician, and marrying those lot together. So very often he would be comfortable and at home in the worship places of various other religions and faiths, and that gave people a bit of a confusion as to where he really stood. But I go back to my experience with him and Archbishop Tutu, that he was a committed Christian.
Did you pray with him in prison?
Yeah.
And I'm just conscious, you know.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Afrikaans.
Here we are, you know, in the middle of a working day, working week, and we've all come from various jobs and we've got all sorts of things on our mind. What would you say we can take from Nelson Mandela as a man, as a leader, from his story, just in our life and in our world?
Nelson Mandela was always, even in prison, he came across as this warm-hearted person, whether with orphaned African children, whether with his favourite singing group. Anyone know which that was? The Spice Girls. Used to do the Mandela jive when the Spice Girls came to South Africa, or even with the Queen. Do you know he was one of the few people that always called Her Majesty Liz? And here's an anecdote story, can I say that?
Yeah, good.
And Zelda said it, she was his wife, PA, said it is totally true. Maybe one of those, you'll have to phone up Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle and ask her. But on one of the visits to England, when he greeted the Queen, he said, Liz, and this is the naturalness of Mandela. He said, Liz, it's so wonderful to see that you put on a bit of weight since I last and you see, because in the Xhosa tradition, to be a little bit, whatever, portly is a sign of well-being. But I say that because that was the natural, people-loving person, whether the Queen or whether children on the street. I think I've wandered far from
No, not at all. Please wander away. I want to come to 1995, and there's an iconic image that any sports person, or not even sports people, will remember. So, Rugby World Cup in South Africa, context of the Springbok team had been almost a symbol of the apartheid, had it not? And then what happens on that?
Okay, the Springbok somehow became the symbol of apartheid South Africa. It became a hated symbol, okay? And so you have this iconic, you have the World Cup rugby final. Mandela's been president for a year. He became president in '94, so I'm not sure if it was a full year. I can't quite actually remember. And you have this almost fairy tale final of South Africa playing New Zealand. But if you've read the book, The Rugby Match That Healed a Nation, and that, South Africa shouldn't have actually got into the final, because in Durban was the semi-final against France, and they had a tropical cyclone, and the match was going to be called off, and France would have gone through to the final because it was so close. They had one less penalty than South Africa, so they had helicopters over Kings Park trying to suck the water up. They had ladies with squeegees, and South Africa's leading 1916 with a minute and a bit to go, and Benazir, the Algerian Frenchman, scores a try. They really made it 21-19, but they didn't have video replays, and the ref didn't see it, and so he didn't give the try. And Benazir, to his credit, I'm getting to your question, sorry if I'm a bit long-winded, he said when he got into the dressing room, he wept, because you know in rugby if you scored the try. And he said, but when he saw how that rugby match healed a nation, he wept even more. And I take my hat off to Benazir for saying that. But it was such an iconic moment. There you got Mandela going in the rugby togs of Francois Pienaar, who was the South African rugby captain, with a springbuck, the hated symbol of apartheid, emblazoned on his there. And of course, the scores are even at half-time, at full-time, and then Joel Stransky kicks the drop goal. And, you know, it was almost like it was foreordained that Mandela could go there dressed, the president of the nation dressed in springbuck rugby togs, and present the Wilbur Webb Ellis Trophy to Francois Pienaar. And they hugged an African and a white man, an Afrikaner, the springbuck captain, and that probably more than the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, more than the national anthem in 5 languages and the apartheid national anthem, was all Mandela's idea, that, and the liberation anthem. The flag, if you see the South African flag, it was Mandela's idea to bring it together. You've got the green, black and gold of the African liberation movement, and you've got the red, white and blue of the colonial powers, and you've got that V in the middle showing the two coming together. But the rugby match was probably the iconic moment of reconciliation.
And when you think of that image, and I can picture it now, and then you think back to when you first met him, he's in prison, years from release, you've got this incredibly divided country, which even more divided than I ever knew. How would you characterise that transformation? You know, and how did that happen? You know, and how did this one man, I know it wasn't just about the one man, but what was it about him that somehow managed to emerge from prison, not bitter, and actually try to heal a nation?
He had perhaps two or maybe three, I'll quote them off the top of my head, but they encapsulate the man. He said when he walked out of Victor Verster prison, he said, I knew if I didn't leave all my bitterness and resentment behind, I'd be walking out of one prison but into another of my own making. He said, and these were the sort of ethos that he lived by. And he said, resentment and bitterness is like you drinking poison and hoping it kills your enemies. And I just read a quote from him in a little book last night where he said, if you've been in prison for trying to transform a society, when you come out, there's no time for unforgiveness and to be retaliative, because you have to then transform the society. That was the ethos that he lived by, David. And you say others. Yes, others, but I don't like to, almost single-handedly, without Mandela, and to a lesser extent, never leave out President F.W. de Klerk, because he also got converted. That was the interesting thing. The nation was praying. Botha would have never let Mandela out, and there would have been a civil war. Botha's laid aside, and in the country everyone thought, well, the worst scenario would be F.W. de Klerk. Everyone thought, well, Pip Botha would be the ideal one, because F.W. de Klerk was on the, I don't think it is an English word, Afrikaans is verkrampte, verlichte. Verlichte is enlightened, and the opposite of enlightened, can't think of the English word, but in that time, F.W. de Klerk got converted, and somehow the two found each other. When he was at Victor Verster prison, obviously F.W. de Klerk couldn't go to the prison, he would be seen, so Mandela was driven to the state prison's residence in Cape Town under a blanket in the back seat of a motor car when the talk started. And they found each other and they got the Nobel Peace Prize together. So, but you know, you even to this day, Mandela with a small g is regarded by many people as almost a god in South Africa. Bear in mind, he was the same age as my father. My father was 3 months older. And here I come in there as a white South African, young enough to be his son, who he lost in a road accident, and he received me, embraced me, and that says a lot for the man.
There seems so much wrong in this world, and we'll all have been through different struggles, and obviously nothing on the scale of what Mandela went through. And yet, how would you say those struggles and sufferings shaped him? Would he have been the same without those, even though it was so unjust? And what can we take from that?
No, I think you know when he spoke in his summing up at the Rivonia trial to the judge for 2.5 hours, and his last words were, he's had this ideal of a democratic and free society, and he was facing the death penalty because South Africa still had. It's an ideal which I hope to live for, but if necessary, I'm prepared to die for. And then he sat down, not knowing if he'd get the death penalty. And he was driven with that idea, with that driving to bring a nation together. What was your question?
What can we, I suppose, when we face adversity and things, what can we take from it?
I think never lose the hope. And sometimes good can come out of bad. Good can triumph over evil. And I think Mandela never lost that hope. Even in the darkest days in prison, and boy, those first 13 years, sleeping on a mat on the floor with a big bucket in the room to do their toilet in because they were locked from 4 o'clock to 5:30, and 2 aluminium plates, eating with their hands, nothing else. It changed a bit after that. To maintain that hope that somehow good can come out of it. And I think that's a fantastic example.